Final Fantasy, a series that has seen many ups and downs in its long 36 years of captivating its audience with its amazing storytelling and gameplay, each iteration trying to improve or change into new directions that the previous main entry didn't. From humble beginnings back on the Nintendo Entertainment System as a simple RPG to now being on a PlayStation 5 as a stylish action RPG, how does Final Fantasy XVI fare in this new uncharted territory for the series? Before I discuss my take on Final Fantasy XVI, I need to establish who I am first and the ground rules. Hi, most call me Lord. No, not the religious kind, and I'm an advocate for gaming. Video games have always been a passion for me, and stylish action games like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising, and so much more is where I shine my best. Now, since this is the first time I'm making something like this in this format, I want to establish the rules for a fair analysis. Number 1. I will remain mostly neutral in discussing the pros and cons while making sure my personal opinions are ones that don't contradict the neutrality. This way I can give my take on things and leave it up to your discretion if you feel it's justifiable or not. Number 2. I will base my comparisons mostly on the series as a whole where it's applicable and not use outside sources heavily. This is to make sure that I look at the game on its own merits and not that of similar games in the genre, as that would be a bias and go against the neutrality. However, I will point out the similarities where it's present itself and give personal takes that only apply to me and not the game itself. I will also want to be able to provide clarity when speaking about these things on a personal standpoint, as there's a lot of opinions that I have seen online about the game that I think is unwarranted or misplaced in some form. Now let's begin. Now I have on and off played the Final Fantasy series over the years, and growing up around Devil May Cry and Kingdom Hearts, I always wondered and wanted a more action-oriented Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy XIII will forever be the biggest tease of that idea. Anyway, when the trailer of Final Fantasy XVI appeared all the way up to the demo, my expectations were somewhat high for what the story could be, as well as the gameplay possibilities. So did it deliver? Well, let's start with the backstory. The backstory comprises of 4 nations in Balestia: Rosaria, Sembrek, Dhalmekia, and Waloed, each having their own stake in the world, as each nation are fighting over the control of Valestia's mother crystals, which act as a source of power for the nations, allowing the use of magic through ether crystals, a tiny byproduct of the mother crystals. However, there are those who don't need the ether crystals to cast magic. They are known as bearers, which are people who are treated less than humans and are subjected to doing tasks as slaves. Then there is the crystal-lined Dominion that is in between Storm and Ash, the continents that make Valestia, which becomes a focal point later in the story because of the war between the nations. The reason why this war is happening at all is because the world is suffering from a plague known as the Blight that is turning the lands barren and lifeless, taking the land's ether, making it impossible to use magic or for any source of life to exist in those places, thus starting a territorial war among the nations to gain more land as quickly as possible. Each nation formed an alliance in some way with another to ensure their survival as the war persists throughout the story. Besides bearers, there are people known as dominants who have the powers of an icon, which are the summons from previous entries of the series. The dominants act like gods or tools of war depending on the nation they reside in. There are 9 in total, but only 8 are present in the main game: the Phoenix, Shiva, Rama, Titan, Garuda, Odin, Bahamut, and the outlier among them, Ifrit, a second icon of fire besides the Phoenix. Leviathan, or as named in the story Leviathan the Lost, is planned to be part of a DLC campaign in the near future at the time of making this video. It's pretty obvious at this point that something is amiss. How can there be 2 icons of fire? Which sets the stage for the events of the game as you play as Clive Rosfield, the dominant of Ifrit, and travel the world trying to make a world a place where people can live and die by their own terms. Now, I don't want to go too deep into the story because there is a lot to unpack, so I want to just point out the few things I think are worth noting. I highly recommend playing the game or watching some videos that can properly convey the story better than I can in this regard. Now, do I think the story was good? Yes, absolutely. The story is one of the strongest parts of 16. There is so much to it that it's really hard to do it justice in this style of video. However, this doesn't go without some drawbacks, one of which is the pacing. Many of the problems I hear people talking about is how it's a chore for them to keep pushing through the story and just stop midway through. This is usually because of the side quests, which I will get into in more detail at the gameplay portion of this video. Now, another thing that I heard and was brought to my attention by a small group of people is that the game isn't relatable. So now this is where I start pointing out the misconceptions. What makes a good story? Is it that the story is relatable? You could say that, but actually I don't think that's the entire truth of it. In my opinion, what makes a good story is that it's believable. Yes, a believable story can be relatable, however it is impossible to truly relate with something, as even though we can all share a similar experience, we all handle said experience in different ways. Good storytelling requires you to get invested in the characters in the world and make you feel something towards them, be it good or bad if that was the writer's intention. I don't think anyone is going to truly relate to being abandoned by their own mother after birth, all because they were born a bearer and she saw them as only a thing and not a person. Or have a kid who demands tricks from them like a dog to not even show remorse when said bearer dies until it's brought up to them after the fact. The point is that if any of the stuff I just said made you feel something uncomfortable, then that means the story did its job of making you believe the narrative is trying to convey. 16 does a lot of world building and the side quests show this in strides. Many of the characters you encounter are going through their own problems due to the war, and you can see how each nation is influenced by these actions. We also see a lot of character development among the roster of side characters, to which leads to another misconception I've been told about: the treatment of female characters in the game. Now, 16 is a darker themed Final Fantasy game inspired by European medieval times. If you know your history, one of the most common practices in those times is being a courtesan, aka a prostitute. It wasn't uncommon for nobility to have mistresses or multiple partners. So of course the game is going to show something of the like, with characters like Benedicta who act free-spirited, and Dame who literally runs a brothel, but the Dame is probably one of the more influential side characters in the story. Let me explain. After some major events in the story involving Ultima and his attempts to gain the power of Ifrit that resides within Clive, only to fail, Ultima resorts to causing ether floods, an event that happens when high concentrations of magic randomly forms in a location, all over Valistia, to destroy the bonds Clive has with the many characters you end up befriending up to this point. The ether floods aren't really the main threat, but what comes after. We learn early in the story when creatures are oversaturated with ether, they become Akashic beings with no will and are hostile towards non-Akashic beings. The only beings that have a tolerance for this is, you guessed it, bearers and dominants. We also learned that Ultima is able to control the Akashic Horde, and thus he commands them to attack every town that Clive has close connections to, one in particular being Northreach. This leads to Clive on a wild race against time to protect all his comrades and the people around them. This takes us back to the Dame, Isabel. She calls for Clive's assistance in Northreach, and we find out that Northreach is under a new leadership by the former High Cardinal of Sanbreque, the Duke of Oriflamme, after the destruction of the capital by Bahamut's rage that Clive and Joshua, Clive's younger brother and dominant of the Phoenix, stopped. The Duke wants to rebuild the Holy Empire of Sanbreque in Northreach, and is somewhat stubborn about his approach on the matter, not even caring about the residents and their safety during this crisis. This also doesn't sit well with most, as some start to leave the army and work with the Dame, who at this point has helped Northreach every chance she gets, and shows she deeply cares for its people, while the Duke and his daughter are fighting over ideals concerning Northreach. Eventually this all becomes a disaster, as the Akashic numbers after multiple attempts prior is big enough to completely overwhelm Northreach, if everyone doesn't pull together. With the swift actions of the Dame and her ability to rally everyone together for the last defense against the invasion, the Duke and daughter become more open-minded after the fact. The Duke even says that people like the Dame should be in charge of leading people due to how she shows so much sympathy and love for the people of Northreach. I think by the time that you get to this point in the game, many people have already put the game down and didn't see it all the way to its conclusion. I had asked people when this misconception was brought up that if they finished the game or not. They all said no. Now, I'm not trying to say this is a bad or anything, because even I had to put the game down for like 3 months due to college or personal life. However, I think when it comes to these sort of comments, it's better to play the entire game and get a full picture before voicing any concerns. The many side characters are very strong-willed in their own ways, and they become very memorable by the end, and by then, many of the problems with the story or character portrayal disappear. From characters like Blackthorn to the Dame, hell, we can't forget Uncle Byron, who is a character that can be comedic relief and at the same time sympathetic, loving role model to Clive. These characters are honestly what pushed me through the game just as much as the gameplay, and it shows many times throughout. Now let's talk about the ending. This has got to be one of the most controversial endings I've ever seen from a game in a very long time. I recommend looking up discussions surrounding it, but what do I think about it? How do I view this ambiguous ending? Well, I'm on the fence. I like the ending, but I can see both sides of the fence on how the ending can be interpreted. One conflicting Clive's character build up to this point, and the other just being more mysterious as to who is alive in the end, with many items in the game suggesting Clive surviving after the fight with Ultima. I totally recommend looking at Hidden Symbolisms in Final Fantasy XVI by Max Derritt, I hope that I pronounced that name right, as it explains not only Clive's character and the hidden meanings behind some story aspects, but also talks about the ending in a ladder that Clive may have survived. A link to their video in the description. Now, how I view the ending is like this. It felt like a true ending to a flame. What do I mean by that? Well, besides the obvious connotation of flame symbolizing a freed in the Phoenix, I feel like much of the story is like the life of a flame. The story of Clive starts as a humble spark, a flicker that shines brightly with purpose. By the time we get to the middle of the story, it becomes a wildfire with no control or sense of direction or purpose, then later becomes controlled, focused on the task it's meant to do, but is handled with care. Then, like a match dying out, Clive is left lying there on the shore with no cheers, praise, or loved ones close by. He is alone under the night sky, and just like a match, the flame dies out. Nothing left but silence after the task has been fulfilled to give people a world that they can live and die as free men on their own terms. Now, we're at the gameplay section, and this will probably be the easiest for me to talk about given my history with action games. So what do I think of Final Fantasy XVI's combat? How does it hold up? Well,